like to go on to Pratna, who is from Nepal, and then have a discussion around it. Over to you, Pratna.
Yeah, hello. Hi everyone. So I'm Prarthana and I'm from Kathmandu, and I'm really excited to be here. So talking about my journey, I think it's been very bumpy, like every one of us. So people in South Asia can probably relate to the fact that talking about pleasure has always kind of been a stigmatized, a taboo thing. And it was very later in life that I started exploring with my sexuality and started to be more free talking about it in spaces like these. And I'm really grateful for such spaces to exist because it kind of makes me feel like I'm not alone, listening to other stories and just resonating with them. And yeah, when I was when I was small, even menstruation periods used to be like a very big thing. I remember once in the bathroom when I once saw a red thing, and I think that was from my mom. My mom had used the bathroom, and I had seen like yeah, it was red, and I had asked her, and she was like, "Yeah, it happens when you grow up." And then later, when everyone started menstruating, at the age of 12 and 13, 12, 11, 12, 13, it was a very big deal. And for me, it was like something that we were excited about as well, because when other girls started to get it, I was kind of like, oh my God, why am I not getting it? And then when I finally got it, it was like, I think more even I think the time of puberty is this very confusing age where you don't know what to do, even mentally. I mean, obviously, there are physical aspects, like, just bleeding from your body is just very new to you. But the other aspects, I don't think so. We talk about them, because for me, when I recall those years of my life, I was having a very difficult time, because you can't talk about it with your friends as well because they're going through it, but I think they're ashamed to talk about it, so you don't talk to them. And your family, obviously, it's very difficult because it's already stigmatized. But going through hormonal changes and stuff, it's also very difficult. And I think that was when I was starting to have like body image issues, like from hair. Like, I don't know. I've had a lot of issues with coming to terms with my body, like especially something like hair. Like it's only now in my 20s that I've started to be comfortable with it. But when I was growing up, like body hair was like a big deal for me. Like I remember shaving for the first time and just getting a lot of cuts, and then just normalizing that fact, and then and even other things, like just emotionally, you're going through so much, and it sort of affects you academically and stuff. um so yeah, that was my story with menstruation. Like for a long time, it was very difficult for me, even physically. Like I used to bleed a lot. I remember having stains, when I was in my periods. And at one point, I think it was like a very open secret that, oh, she bleeds a lot, because whenever I got my periods, I used to always have like a few incidents where I would just overflow, like the blood would overflow, and stains and stuff. So it was already an open secret. So yeah, like that puberty thing for me was a very confusing age, and even like dealing with bullying, especially related to body image and stuff. Like I used to be quite fat at the time, and then suddenly I lost a lot of weight and like bodily changes and stuff. And then later, with things like pleasure, a funny thing is that I explored masturbation at a very young age. It was only later that I found out it was masturbation. But I found that I actually only found that out a while back, that it was masturbation, because I used to do a thing where I would wrap my legs around each other. and it would give me some kind of comfort. So I realized that when I was in grade 4. I found that trick when I was in grade 4. So I didn't know that was masturbation. And then I came across a post that was similar to mine. And then there were stories, there were like comments on the post that said that, yeah, I also discovered that pretty early and stuff. And it made me feel pretty nice, because for a long time I used to think that that was unnatural and stuff. But to see that so many people discover something like masturbation very early is also something that we should talk about, because masturbation is always linked with something sexual, but it's not. Because if you can discover it at the age of, like, I don't know, before even you, when you're like even before you're a teenager, it just, yeah. So I think that's when I kind of started to even think about pleasure outside of, sex, or just having sexual undertones, because you discover it before it, right? Even like when kids start playing with their genitals, it's like we hush it and stuff, but it's really common and stuff. So that was when I realized that, it's also important to kind of separate it having sexual undertones, because that's when the shame starts, and that's when, like, the stigmatization of sex also happens. And yeah, and in terms of school as well, like, we're never taught about sex through a pleasure gaze. It's always through this biological lens, because we first were taught about sex in grade 7, and when we were in the 7th grade, it was taught through this very, yeah, so, like, this happens, and then, like, that's how babies are made. But we were never taught about it from, like, okay, why do we do it, why do people like it and stuff. And then like, I think Onogya had mentioned in our very first session that, a lot of what we learn in school is through this fear-based approach, where it teaches us that, oh, if you have sex, you'll get STDs and stuff, so you need to prevent it, but never through this more, yeah, it's nothing. It's actually very nice, and it's a nice experience. It's natural and stuff. So I think that needs to change. And even about bodily autonomy, just a few years back, like 2 years back, I was talking to my friends, and then we were talking about tampons and stuff. And the thing about so in Nepal, a lot of us use pads. So not many people know that there are actually two holes. So we were talking, and then, like, we just we're talking about this stuff thing where, like, there's a different hole for peeing, and then there's a different hole for, like, where the blood comes out from, right? And they were shocked. They were like, what? I really thought that, peeing, and then, like, yeah, the blood comes from the same hole. So I think it's very and I'm not, like, surprised that, they didn't know, because it's actually very common. Like, I don't know so many things about my own vagina and about my own autonomy, because there's so much shame around it. So I think it's very important to also have workshops where we know about our own autonomy. Yeah, so that's what I wanted to say. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ratna. I think there are so many things that you shared with your experiences as well that we can relate to. So thank you so much for being with us here today. And thank you to Dolina as well. Just with the experiences that we've heard so far, this was something that we can reflect on and something that we've experienced ourselves. So now this is something that I would like to ask our participants. Since the stories that we've heard, I'm pretty sure there are a lot of things that we might have resonated. So I want to ask you all, and maybe this is a question that you can reflect on and maybe also share it with us. How was it for you in your journey with discovering your bodies as young men, women, or non-binary folks as well? How has that experience been for you of learning about your body? So your journey with your body, if you'd like to share or even like reflect on whatever stories that has been shared with us right now, please feel free to either use the chat option or unmute yourselves. We would love to hear from you.
With regards to this, I have something to share. like we have been conducting focus group discussions here in India, and Anuka has also there in Nepal. And one of the things that when we discuss about our bodily changes, when we had this discussion with men, they, at first they would laugh because oh no, we don't bleed, and then they would laugh it off. But then as we started discussing, they had so much even more to share, and I also learned a lot of new things. They started talking about how when puberty hit them, their breasts started forming a lot, and they had no idea. And one of the guys mentioned he was really worried that he's sick, and he went to consult, but was told that it's only natural. So when we talk about puberty in itself, it becomes such an alarming and scary experience for us when it's supposed to actually be the opposite. It's supposed to be that time of our age where we are finally taught all about our bodies, and we have someone to confide in and ask our queries about our own bodies, through safe spaces. So if you have any similar things that you've experienced or even heard of, if you would like to share.
There was one thing that I wanted to share after hearing Pratna's story. How, like, when we weren't menstruating, we wanted to get our periods so much, like have our first period because everybody else was getting. And I can't believe I actually wished to get my periods. And now that I already have been menstruating for a while now, I'm like, why did I wish for that? So that was something that I kind of like related to it. But yeah.
Yeah, I think Torina also agree to it as well, because she's mentioned about how it was like, she couldn't wait for it because she already had pads at hand. It was only she was only waiting for it to start bleeding for her to finally use the product that your mom gave her. And another interesting thing which that Pratna mentioned about the three holes is how even for us, one of our aunts who is in her late 40s recently found out that we have three holes, and she kept asking my sister about it. It's like, how is that even possible? We're supposed to have two holes down there. Aren't we peeing and bleeding in the same hole and stuff like that? And we had to tell her about the biological aspect and like how our anatomy works as well. And though these are such funny things, I mean experiences, again, it's so telling of how silence around our bodies is universal and also all age groups and all genders.
True, true.
Yeah.
Adding to what we have in the chat, coming to terms with how your body works during puberty is so confusing and exhausting and isn't helped by the way we are taught. Not at all. Agree with that. I feel like only in recent years I've started to understand it to a certain extent. I think a lot of us can relate to that, right? There's so much of confusion, yet we're never taught about it. And we just find not credible sources to learn about these things. And there's so much of lack of body literacy as well. And puberty can be a really confusing time.
Right.
Yeah, I can maybe also share something about it. I'd like to relate to what Kara said as well. And I really related also to what Pratana said about getting the hairs everywhere. Because I remember like I got hair on my vulva a bit earlier than other girls in my class. And then we had to shower after swimming. And at some point, one of the other girls commented that my vulva looked really dirty because it had hair on it. And it really took me years to come to terms with that, and that affect, my body was okay and that it was normal. But I think that having education about that could have done so much that that okay, this is something to expect. Everybody gets it at some point, because I was really ashamed of it. I would always like shower the other way around so people wouldn't see. And
yeah. I completely I've also similarly experienced, but then mine was with my boobs, my breasts, because when it started forming, it just grew so fast and it was really big. And I remember until I was about 19 years old, I would constantly wear loose clothes. However hot the weather may be, there will always be a scarf in front of me, and I wouldn't cut my hair because it used to help me cover it up. And one incident was but then it was only after I moved to the city and I started working on this issue that I started recognizing all of this, and also was empowered with the knowledge around it. So there is also very unfortunate that it took me an internship at an organization that works in this issue for me to actually receive the right information that I lacked. And I remember also one incident about how me and my friends were walking in the street, and this guy just comes and grabbed my boob and ran away. And I was so confused. And she was like, and I was like, did you just see that? And she didn't actually see. And then she went on to say, oh, but Siku, you have really huge boobs. I was like, what does that even mean? That does that even mean that, does the size of my body consent to other people doing things to me? So I think I feel like the thing about puberty, especially when we're so confused about our body, is also that we feel so unsafe, and we feel so objectified and sexualized without our consent, as if, us walking down the street could be, um, and it might require us to put on a brave act in itself, to simply even walk down the street. Right. Curious mentions about how there is little space and credible information in school. You learn a lot from peers when you're young, which can be full of myths. True. Same. And it's such a cycle. Another thing is also, as we are discussing about this, also in our group discussions, one of the guys mentioned about how he his friend in the hostel had a phone, and it was the only phone in the hostel, and they will take turns to download pornography and watch it turn by turn, and that was actually his first time of seeing sex as an act, and before that he had no knowledge around it. Anugia, did you face anything similar in your research or group discussion?
Yes, I think just with I'll just add something and Pragya can go next. So just with our group discussion itself, we had a group of men where we were talking about how they learned about sex. And it was mentioned how pornography was one of their initial ways of learning about sex. And this was like something that everybody agreed with till a very a point in their life. They thought that women are not sexual beings and it's only men who have sexual desires. And like we had 5 individuals in the group discussion and everybody was like, yeah, I felt the same. And only later, like, after they grew up and like, talked with their female friends as well, that they realized that, women can be sexual as well. Pragya, you can go next.
Thanks, Nigya. Yeah, I just resonated with what Sekulu was saying. So I was really young when I was first introduced to pornography, and it was also not, I was not prepared for it. Like I was in school, and someone like showed it to me on the phone. They were like, "Oh my God, look at this," and so that was such a traumatic experience for me, actually. That when like I became scared of having penetrative sex, and so much so that I was like, oh my God, I'm never gonna have babies. It's gonna be so traumatizing for me. And then it took me so much. It took me a lot of time to get over it and actually develop like a very intimate, safe relationship with my sexual partner at that time. So it's also that information of the right kind and access to information and access to misinformation is so widespread. Like you also need to be able to counter that, because knowing like the wrong information can also do so much of harm. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so true. And then again, the question remains at why then is there no comprehensive sexuality education when such information, education that youths are receiving is so adulterated? And this is something that I like to tell stakeholders when we discuss. It's like, just because you don't want young people to have sex doesn't mean they're not having sex. So just give them the right information, right? Yeah.
Just addressing a message in the chat box. Parents, guardians make the mistake of assuming that we know sexuality education when they don't even make an attempt to talk to us about it. Exactly, like because our culture, sexuality and talks around sexuality is so tabooed, we don't even talk about it. And one of the funny stories that came up in our research was, and maybe we should go to our research discussion in a while, but one of the things that came up was how when a teacher was teaching sex ed to a group of students, the teacher actually told his students, what he said was, you all know more than me about this, so we will not read this chapter. That actually happened in one of our participants' school. So we can just see like there's such a lack of conversations around sexuality, what sex means, what pleasure is, and these conversations are not even talked about. If anybody has anything else to share, maybe you all can put it in the chat, but we can move to our next section where me and Seku will be talking about our research, and just put it in in our chat box, whatever you're thinking, whatever you're reflecting, and if you relate with our stories. I think exactly the skipped the reproductive health in chapter as well. And there's so much of discomfort. This is something that we really saw when we tried to see how sex ed is carried out in Nepal. But before that, I would like to get to know this more. Seku, how like in India specifically with your research, how do youths learn about their bodies and pleasure?
So youths here in Nagaland, especially since right now we are focusing on Nagaland, they learn it from, like we mentioned, internet pornography. So according to the survey that we had, most about 80% of the youths received their sex ed from internet, and which includes pornography and media and movies. And I mean, talking about what Pragya mentioned about how reproductive health chapter is skipped, we also had a lot of that as well about how this information is not given in schools. And one of the male participant mentioned about how the teacher skipped this particular diagram on reproductive health, and it actually came for their finals, and all of them had to lose 5 marks. So these are also telling of how and why actually teachers are so teachers are so uncomfortable to discuss this topic. And another youth participant mentioned about how their teacher when they reached the chapter of reproductive health, he actually got a nurse from outside and asked her to teach the girl students, the female students, about the chapter, and he took the male students to another room to teach them about reproductive health. So when we are discussing about this topic, we also felt the importance for it to be non-gendered, because when we have a certain language to impart to female students and when we have a certain language to impart to male students, it also creates a diversion about how the language in itself and the education in itself is different, and it's designed differently for the two. So their understanding of consent and bodily autonomy is also shifted, and mostly again the cis-het male centered. And how about Anugia? What was your experience with your youth?
I think just with like how youths learn about their bodies and pleasure, in an ideal world, it would be through sex education, right? And when we did our research, we actually had 102 respondents to our surveys. So one of the questions that we asked was like, have you ever received sex ed in your school, in your institutions? And surprisingly, 76.5% of them said that they have received sex ed. So I was like, yay, amazing. Something's going on well here. But when we asked them how satisfied they were with the sex ed that they received, only 9 out of the 76.5% of people who replied that they had received sex ed said that they were either satisfied or very satisfied. So what we see here is, even though our institutions have sex ed, but the quality of it does not meet the needs of what the youths want. And one of the things that a lot of people are even pointing out in our chat is how there's this skip the chapter culture, where either you're not taught or the professor or the teacher is just going to skim through the chapter. And it's like taught in a very theoretical manner, or just for the exam. You need to learn this because it's going to come in the exams. It's a very theoretical approach as well. And I think one thing that came up with our research was, and this is something that I really found interesting, was how sex education has been sexualized in our schools. And what that basically means is sex ed is not comprehensive at all. And oftentimes it's seen as a vulgar chapter, in the sense that if you talk about sex, or if you give sex education, you're going to you encourage premarital sex. Like, that's the idea about it. So sex ed is not seen as a holistic tool that teaches you more about your body, how to navigate your life, either sexual life or your adulthood or during puberty, but it's seen as something that encourages premarital sex. Right. So in that way, their whole understanding of sex ed is really skewed as well. And specifically talking about the content of it, as you've already mentioned, how it is cis-het male-centric, there's also a lot of, risk-based approach, like as Prathna mentioned as well, how, you care. It's shown as being sexually active is something that's bad and you're going to get diseases, STDs, STIs, which is important to know about. But risk-based approach is not the approach. Because when we talk about youths involving in sexual activities, it's because they want to explore their pleasure, right? Most of the times it's not for reproduction, yet it's very reproductive focus. So even when we talk about the content, it is very risk-based, and it does not even tell us about gender identities, sexuality. There's no mention of the LGBTQIA plus community. It's very penetration focused. And the services that is available in our nation is not even talked about. These are the things that we need. So what we see with this is like, this is a situation of sex ed in Nepal. And because of that, most of the times people access information through porn. And we asked that in our survey as well. And 62.7% of our respondents said that they have used porn to learn about sex. And that can be very damaging, because just the way it's performative and everything, it's really problematic in that sense, right? So these are some of the ways that youth learn about it: through porn, through talking with their partners or closest friends who they can share these intimate experiences with, maybe cousins and siblings. And one thing that made us realize was, considering so many youths have these conversations with their peers, capacity building with comprehensive sexuality education among youths is really important, because oftentimes more than adults, people go to their peers, right? So that's, as like advocates itself, working with SRHR, it's important to work with capacity building with youths as well. So these are some of the resources that youths have used in Nepal to learn more about their sexuality and their bodies.
Yes, thank you, Anukya, and also Sekulu. So while like in this part we are talking about Sekulu's and Anukya's research, I would really like to invite all the participants to also share your reflections in the chat, like what resonates from you, what comes from your experience. So I would like to go on with the next question from the research. I think the next question does go with a trigger warning. So like the question is, so yeah, you were already talking a bit about how like the discussions that we often have around sex, especially in sexuality education, really miss the pleasure and consent component. So how do you think that perpetuates violence in your context? So maybe Sekulu, you could share first on this question.
Thank you, Atmi. And yes, I think we also had a lot of discourse around this topic in our last session, about how silence perpetuates violence, and also lack of conversations around consent also perpetuate violence. And when we discussed this, when we asked youths about what consent means to them, or how was their relationship with their bodies with regards to the way they've received sex education or sexuality education, so to say, they mentioned about a lot of fear, fear in their relationship with their bodies. And also another interesting thing is how they're also really confused, because the difference, also talking about the differences in our context, though Anuge and I are working with a similar age group, and being neighboring countries, we also have a lot of issues and a lot of realities where we share with each other. But then also Anuge's target had more of urban cities, youths from urban city, and ours had more of between rural and urban city of Nagaland. So the difference was that they did, since there is so much silence around the conversation, there is not much way for them to also define their issues for themselves. So when we talk about pleasure, however universal it may be, since it's absent, we don't even have conversation around contraception for young people, so to say. So when there is so much silence around it, there is the confusion. And so when we have this conversation, what we like to start from has been through the already existing data that we have with regards to how our state is still the second highest in the country, with HIV and AIDS, as well as with our increasing number of teenage pregnancies, and so on and so forth. And this is so telling of how, though despite our society here is needed in a sense of to be very conservative, and with the whole abstinence culture and education being imparted, it is only telling how young people are confused, but also they want to explore their sexuality. And when this gap keeps increasing, their health itself are at risk. So when we discuss about pleasure-based approach to CSE, for us it was actually really different, because we had to start from go back to the start about how was their puberty for them, how was the experience for them, was it good, or where was like most part of it scary for them. So then what is the pleasure in having a body when you're so scared of having it, or rather when you have no information about your own body? Yeah, Anuga, do you have, yeah, how was your experience with the youth in Nepal?
I think this is such an important question, right? Like how lack of conversations around consent and pleasure actually perpetuates violence. And just with what Seku said, like when we don't have discussions around pleasure and consent, it's so difficult to define the issue, as you put it out, because you don't understand when your consent is being violated, what your rights are, because you don't talk about it. And again, I think this was mentioned in our previous session as well. When we talk about marital rape in so many countries, it's not even recognized as a crime. And when marital rape itself is not recognized, even if your rights are being violated, there's violence there, you are not aware of it because that's not how we see it, right? So I think that's just so important. Like when we don't talk about consent, when we don't talk about pleasure, we cannot define the issue, but also we are scared of our own bodies because so much of guilt and shame. Lack of conversation does not mean that we don't, there are no narratives around it. It means that lack of conversation means that there's guilt and shame in these conversations because we don't talk about it. And if there is curiosity for individuals to explore, then it comes with a lot of guilt and shame with it. And that's what we've seen with a lot of people when we ask them how they perceived their relationship with their body as young, yes, as young adults or when they were kids as well, and how oftentimes anything related to masturbation or their pleasure in any forms was an aspect, a journey of guilt and shame. And that's something that we have internalized, and it's so difficult for people to deconstruct that, right? And just specifically talking about the research that we have done and how we can connect lack of conversations with how it perpetuates violence, going back to what the main source of sex ed has become these days, and that is pornography, mainstream porns, basically. Because since we don't have sex ed, proper sex ed, and we do not have resources, credible resources to talk about it, either we go to friends who get knowledge from other friends who watch porn, somehow it comes to porn. And that is problematic because porn has a very skewed understanding of how sex looks like, right? And oftentimes, because we are embedded in this patriarchal structure, we see that the way that sex is performed, and I would say performed because it's not how it happens in real life, right? The way it's performed kind of adds to this whole cis het male-centric pleasure that we've been talking since the beginning of our session today. And there we can see there is this traditional binary roles of being masculine, what masculinity means like, what femininity means like when you're engaged in a sexual activity. These are very pronounced. So as young adults who don't know what sex means, if this is our learning point, it's really difficult for us to deconstruct that, right? And it affects us a lot because the way male gaze works with porn, you tend to sexualize and objectify women where they're not seen as subjects of sexual desires, right? But they're seen as objects of sexual desire for men. And when we had this conversation again with a lot of people about how porn has affected them, specifically when we talked with men, they said how rough sex is so glorified. And there's also this idea of how masculinity should look like. And when there's so much of glorification of rough sex that it accepts violent behavior. And oftentimes that becomes our understanding of what sex looks like. It needs to be rough. The man needs to be dominant. And not only does this like fetishize violence, but also we don't go beyond heteronormative sex, right? We don't go and learn about queer experiences. And even when queer experiences are seen, we see it's through the male gaze, it's through the heteronormative gaze, where again, traditional binary roles are seen and it's not how reality looks like. So I think overall, when porn becomes our understanding of how sex looks like, it carries on to us in our lives because we have internalized those narratives, internalized how sex should look like. And again, if you are glorifying violence, it perpetuates violence in real life as well. And specifically talking about pleasure and consent communication, how much of that have we seen in porn? Do we see consent communication at all? And as young adults, we think that's how sex looks like. You just penetrate somebody without, like, having a conversation about it. So it's just, I feel like this whole resource of getting sex education, when that becomes porn, it perpetuates violence, because the mainstream porn that we're talking about is problematic and it affects the way we look at sex. So I think these are some of the findings that we've had through our research.
Yeah, in addition to that, the whole conversation then again comes down to patriarchy, because it is also the glorification of how masculinity should look like and how femininity should look like. And this is a conversation that we also had in our group discussions with the youth. And a group of male, they all agreed that they do not, they all agreed. And also they started having this conversation, by the way, by themselves within the group discussion, because we lack so much space, we lack such spaces right here to have such conversation. And they did mention about how male consent within already assumed partnership, sexual partnership, is also often invisible, because when it's their female partner is in the mood, or so to say, they have to involve in. So then even their sense of consent is not really highlighted within their sexual partners, considering that, okay, you've known each other for long, and there's nothing that you really have to do, like stuff like that. So it really comes down to how the language around sex in itself and sexuality in itself is so patriarchal. And for us to deconstruct also means we have to go back at where it started, and to have those conversations first, and also start undressing shame for all of us.
Thank you, Sekulu, and also Anukia. I think those were incredibly interesting reflections. Also want to raise attention to the point that Sami raised in the chat, how often sex education and also porn is very white focused. So it's not just male dominant, but that also Black women are, and often genders are over or hyper sexualized. And I think, yeah, just like people that sort of fall outside of the categories that are the mainstream are, I think, very like portrayed very stereotypical in that sense, which is very problematic, I would say. Like they also, they're of course very, very different, and they have their own sexual desires. So yeah, and if that is the information that we get, then sorry, Sekulu, go for it.
Sorry, Yadmi, with regards to what Sami mentioned, we also had that issue here in India. The few of us, we have the Mongoloid features, and there was an issue where this writer wrote a very, very sexualized graphic on Mongoloid features, and sexualizing our racial features, and it created a huge uproar, because a lot of us women, we felt so unsafe that particular story was being reshared by a lot of men. And we are women who live alone, in the cities away from home. So that conversation was also quite interesting as well as unfortunate. And that what happens when we again generalize a specific thing, or stigmatize a specific racial identity, even through our writings or even through a joke, there is a domino effect to it, and it's not just a story, then it's a ticket for a lot of people to use that against us as well. So then again, it all comes down to us having to reframe the language that we use, even in our own literature, so that whatever we create is not fostering violence, or leading to creating unsafe spaces for minorities. So yeah, that was a great point, Sami.
Yeah, Anukia?
Sorry, I just wanted to share regarding the hypersexualization and the fetishization part of it as well. This is something that I personally experienced while I was in Europe, because I was like a South Asian woman there, and mostly it was a very white dominant population. The hypersexualization that you feel is so evident, because sharing one particular experience, there was once this man who actually said something in Italian, and I couldn't understand it, but my friend translated it for me. And I was talking to him beforehand, and after a while he went to his friend and he was like, I want to fuck a Nepali girl. And just the way he said that, you can sense so much of, and this was not just one isolated case. There's so many different things that adds to it. So this just withhold this fetishization, and even with lesbian couples, the way that it has been fetishized, which takes away the agency from individuals, right? Because then their sexuality becomes a performance for your pleasure, when that's not the case. Your sexuality, your pleasure is for yourself. And I think, again, this whole adds to how these narratives are being promoted in porn. And men, mostly men, cishet men, grow up with these sort of understanding. And that's seen in cases like Whatever Happened to Me, because like these are not just something that happened to me, but I'm pretty sure a lot of us can relate to these sort of experiences, right? And I think porn just becomes such an a skewed understanding of what sex is. There's so much hypersexualization, and oftentimes it takes in the form of violating other people's consent and perpetuates violence in itself. So it just adds to how, again, how porn can be really problematic as well, specifically for young adults who don't know much about it and have credible resources for it.
Yes, thank you, Anouk. Yeah, I think that was a nice summary also. And I completely agree. I think these stereotypes also exist in many different forms. Like they're more profound for women, but they definitely also exist for men. And I was also thinking about how I recently read this article was written by a guy who wrote it anonymous. And I think he was originally from China, but lived in the Netherlands. And how he strongly felt that actually men from Asian descent were seen as not sexy or non-sexual beings, and that he was scrolling through Grindr, and that very often he saw people like having written "no Asians" on their profile, which is awful. So yeah, it's everywhere. I think the issues are very clear. I would like to turn this conversation around a little bit and also ask Anouk and Sekule, what do you think is the way forwards? Like what should we do? How can we make it better? Anouk, would you like to share first, maybe?
Sure. I think one of the things that I personally believe in is it's really important to institutionalize comprehensive sexuality education, because the sex education that we have right now does not serve our needs. So it's really important to institutionalize it, and not just any form of sex ed, but comprehensive sexuality education. And secondly, it's important to identify our stakeholders and give them training as well, because teachers themselves, and I think a lot of us can relate to it, are uncomfortable to deliver sex ed classes. So how can we sensitize this issue? How can we ensure that, there is more normalization of topics and conversations around sexuality? I think that's important. Second, I believe, is if we are making a curriculum for youths need to be a part of this curriculum making, right? Because if we are not there, you don't understand our needs. And I think that's why it's really important to involve youths in these dialogues. And because oftentimes youths are either not included or not taken seriously. So I think that's a second way that we can move forward with it. And lastly, and this is something that all of us can do starting today, is normalize and redefine how we see sex, pleasure, start this conversation with our friends. So these are some of the things that I think can help us achieve or move forward with whatever resources that we have.
Thank you, Anouk. Yeah, I would also like to invite Sekule, but I see that Godfrey has raised his hand, so I would like to turn to him first. Godfrey, please go ahead.
Hello, everyone. Yeah, I hope you guys can hear me properly. But I'd just like to say thank you very much for whatever has been said in here. It's really great to just be in this kind of space and to just really talk about these issues. At first, I was scared to just even come in because I thought this was a females only space or something like that. I don't know. I hope I didn't offend anyone with that. But it's really just great to just even feel welcome in this space. There have been a lot of things that have been talked about, including letting young people just be a part of the curriculum process, where you have to decide what is for young people. But even if young people have been included in these spaces, they're usually not safe spaces for young people to freely express what they feel about their sexuality. Usually in these spaces, they only accept CSC in regards to reproduction and not pleasure. Pleasure is usually omitted from our discussions. Pleasure is usually regarded as something that's demonic. Pleasure is usually regarded as something that's not practical in our sex lives. Forgetting that there's a huge number of young people that want to engage in sexual activities just for the sake of pleasure. There's a lot of young people that want information to do with their sexuality just for the sake of pleasure. They forget that there's a few young people who really want to engage in sexual practices for the sake of reproduction. And I think that's one of the things that needs really to be emphasized when we are in spaces where we want to talk about comprehensive sexuality education. And I'm really glad that we're really talking about this, because I feel like comprehensive sexuality education is not comprehensive enough, because it really doesn't reflect on our needs as young people. It just touches the surface to say, this is a penis, this is how it functions, this is what happens when you put your penis in an appropriate place. And it's just that, forgetting that there are a lot of things that we're going to face out there concerning our sexuality, and we're not taught about that in our schools. These things are not included in our CSC curriculums, or in our classes, or wherever we're taught anything to do with CSE. So I really hope people who are in the spaces that develop the curriculum for CSE, they are open enough and they create the space to be safe enough for young people, because these spaces are usually dominated by older people, and they ask us young people to say, what do you want? We do not want that, because we're not going to be free to tell them what we want, because we know they're going to judge us, because they know they're going to criminalize us, because we know they're going to demonize us as young people. If we say we want CSE to include an element of explaining pleasure, we want CSE to include an element of masturbating just to understand your body as a young man or as a young woman, they're going to demonize us. They're going to say, why do you want to just continue having sex like that anyhow? Forgetting that sex needs to be enjoyed. Sex doesn't need to be survived. It needs to be enjoyed because it is a good thing. And I think the other thing is we have not talked enough about how sex has been hypersexualized. CSE has been hypersexualized, and a lot of discussions around how men are have to be aggressive and dominant. I don't know if it exists in the circles where women are, but in the circles that men are, we really talk about, oh, I really had sex with this girl and it was rough. And if they're talking about that way, how they were so dominant, it's like it makes a lot of men feel good, and I feel like that's not the right way to go, because if you're having sex with someone, both of you must enjoy. You must understand what your partner wants. You must understand what your boyfriend or your girlfriend wants when you're having consented sex in that manner. So I'm just really glad that we're talking about it. I really wish a lot of other men could be part of it. A lot of other straight or gay men would be in this space to actually just understand what we want as young people in regards to comprehensive sexuality education. So thank you so much for just giving me this opportunity to share my 2 cents. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Godfrey, for sharing. I think Segula wanted to say the same, and I saw a lot of people nodding while you were talking. So I think it really resonated with a lot of us in the audience. And, yeah, so thank you. And I would like to invite Sekulu to share a bit, because we haven't heard from you yet, and I'm sure you also have some inspiring ideas on the way forward.
Yeah, thank you, Yadmik, and thank you, Godfrey. Those were such important points. One thing that a lot of youths also in our focus group discussions, who were male, were like, why are you having all these discussions with more women? We want more discussions around this. We want to talk more about our bodies. And they were actually asking us to host workshops for them, because they want to discuss consent, about how they can also create safe spaces for people around their communities, and also help them, like what Geoffrey was mentioning, address all those issues that the patriarchy puts on men as well, with the masculinity and all the other various things. With regards to the way forward, this is a question actually that we asked our youth as well. And a very interesting thing that we found was that amongst our participants, since, again, like I mentioned, Nagaland is a very conservative Christian state. So based on that, I think it was important to also know that context on why the youths want this. Is when we ask them about where else do you want to talk about sexuality education apart from schools, 80 88.4% said youth events, and 80.3% say they want to have this discussion with your parents, and 44% say they want to have this discussion in the church. So then again, as we work to pursue institutionalizing CSE in schools and institutions, it also means that youths want this conversation to also go in spaces that they inhabit and in spaces that they feel safe in. So it also shows that we also need to have this conversation with our stakeholders, people who work in the churches, our parents themselves, so that once they are equipped with the knowledge, they can also share it with the youths who look up to them and who find whatever they share credible. And another important thing that also came up with our other group discussion with regards to answering to this question is, they also mentioned, yes, institutionalizing CSE is important, but what about our youths who are not part of the schools, who are not privileged or does not have access to schools? And also, what about the students who, the dropout students or the students in other spaces? What about them? So then again, they asked for infrastructure to be able to have this CSE outside of schools as well, so that there are certain activity-based learning school where youths come and discuss about this, and there is a peer-to-peer facilitator who actually educates them and provides them with the right information. And on another note, with regards to CSE being imparted to persons with disabilities, and at least in our state, we have the issue of assuming persons with disability as asexual, and the community here mentioned about how people don't see us as sexual beings. They only see us as, as someone who cannot have that as part of who we are. So they did mention about CSE addressing that narrative as well, so that it is more inclusive in nature, and also with our LGBTQ community as well. So when we talk about CSE and the way forward, I think, as Anugia mentioned, is institutionalizing and having this conversation and having this dialogue around CSE in our own spaces, and also with the communities that we interact with and in the spaces that we inhabit. And I think this event is already a testimony that safe spaces work, and sharing our experiences really work.
Thank you so much, Sekulo. I think that was also the best conclusion for this discussion. I think at the end of the session, we have one final question for you that you can reply to in the chat. I think I saw somebody already copying it, so I think it will appear very soon.
Sure, I can read it out to our participants as well. So,
perfect, thanks, Anukia.
Sure. So this is a question that we would like all of you to reflect on and can be a takeaway from this session as well. So what role can you play to address the barriers of issues of body illiteracy? So what roles us as individuals can take? And with that, I think we've come to the end of our session. Let's just take a minute to think about it. And yes, that's all from my side. Seku, do you want to add something?
No, nothing. Just thank you so much, everyone, for being so participative. Anugia and I, we learn so much more from the participants every time we facilitate. So this is such a privilege to be able to come here and share and listen. So thank you so much.
Yes, so the question is now also in the chat. So I would really like to invite everybody to share your reflections on this last one. I think we're all very curious to hear from every one of you, since we already heard that there's so many amazing ideas in this group.
Exactly. Talk to each other and normalize these discussions. This is something that we don't even need to be a part of an organization for, right? This is something that we can do even right now after this session. As Carrie says, for me, I think a big thing is having conversations. Indeed, that's how we normalize these taboo topics. I can be a human library. As the information I have, I can be able to share with others so that they feel free to openly discuss exactly. We can be that safe spaces that we might have not gotten right, and we can create that spaces for others as well. We can start small with the people that are close to us. Pragya says, I constantly talk about things like consent, bodily autonomy with family and friends back home in India, but also friends here in the Netherlands. Assertive conversations to both parties, address such issues in the spaces that I am in, that is at drinking joints. Indeed. We take these conversations wherever we go. I think these are some of amazing ideas that were coming up right now. Sometimes people are so grateful to have a conversation about taboos, and it is so nice when they realize that you're not judging them. Again, we create those safe, non-judgmental spaces for other people and maybe share our experiences all together. Currently, I have made my younger sister understand that she can openly ask me anything about her body. That is lovely that you're there for them. That's something that we can do as well, like start these conversations with our younger siblings who are there and be that guardian that we might have not had while growing up. If we don't have any other comments, thank you so much for being here with us today. It has been lovely. Kara says she has also tried to have these conversations with her mom and aunt. I can relate to that. But yeah, thank you so much for joining us. We have another one. I've realized that the moment we talk about these issues with our friends without a sense of judgment and entitlement, they open up more and are more free to discuss such. They were brought up to feel super uncomfortable. So Karis is talking about her aunt and mom. Creativity in addressing issues, bringing conversations in a way someone can relate to the issues of body literacy. Then we have somebody sharing, I have made it my life goal to educate my friends about masturbation and orgasm. Love that. Because I'm 23 and most of my friends, they really have no idea about all of this. That's a great thing that you're doing. I think we can all start that conversation. I honestly love yeah, no, I honestly love making people feel uncomfortable at times, like with these conversations, because I think it's necessary to feel that discomfort because we have internalized so much of guilt and shame. But yes, I think now I can say we have come to the end of the discussion. Thank you so much for sharing so many ideas. I like to share ideas about books I'm reading. That's another resourceful thing that we can do. Yes, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us as well, considering we have come to the end of the session as well. So feel free to reach out to us, DM us, and we'll get back to you. Thank you so much, Yanumik, if you want to add something.
Yeah, well, I just want to add a big thank you to Anukia and Sekulu for facilitating another amazing session. So can I get a big round of applause? Really, I think we had such an inspiring morning, starting with like, what do we mean with pleasure, going through the pleasure walk together, hearing the, just like stories with good goosebumps from Tulina and Pratana when we came back after the break. Like, thank you again for sharing with us and feeling that safe space with us. I felt it was a really special moment that we had. And then diving more into the topic of, CSE and what is missing and how can we fix it. And I think so many interesting reflections, inspiring ideas were shared in this room today. Like for us, it's morning. For some of you, it might already be later, like afternoon today. So thanks to everyone. I think we also might need some time to process all of this. At least I feel I do. So I think it's a good moment to go into a break.